I have filled out a great many forms in my life. Compact Trade Registry Form 7C, which is the arbitration intake. Form 11, the session record. Form 22B, the binding summary with signature blocks for both parties, which I always print twice because someone always loses the first copy. I have filled them out in drafty waystation offices and in borrowed desk space in embassy and tea rooms, and once, memorably, balanced on a crate in a loading corridor at Kethanar Hub because the conference room had a ceiling leak and no one had thought to book a backup. I fill out forms the way some men smoke, steadily, without much thought, the hand moving on its own while the mind sits somewhere adjacent and waits to be needed. That is who I was when I arrived at Orith 9 Waystation for the Velhari Boundary Compact sessions. Solon Vaith, Grade 3 Arbitration Clerk, Compact Trade Registry, assigned to document a 12-day treaty negotiation between the Compact and the Velhari Sovereign Authority. I was 47 years old. I had been doing this work for 22 years. I owned a decent coat, a good pair of shoes, a portable writing case I had carried since my first posting, and very few opinions about anything that didn't appear in the Compact Registry Code. I want to be honest about that. Some men, when they tell a story like this one, arrange it so that they arrive with their eyes already open, already the right kind of person for what is coming. I didn't. I arrived at Orith 9 on a connector shuttle from Kethsarath with my writing case, and a Form 11 already half-drafted for the first session and nothing in my head beyond the session schedule and whether the waystation had a decent tea service. I was not looking for anything. I was not ready for anything. I was just a clerk who had been assigned to a treaty week, the way clerks are assigned to things by proximity and availability, and the fact that someone had to go. Orith 9 was one of the older compact neutral ground stations, built in the second expansion period when waystation architecture still aspired to something. High ceilings in the public areas, long windows overlooking the orbital dock, stone floors that held the cold even in high season. The Velhari delegation had the west wing. The compact delegation had the east. The administrative annex in the center belonged to no one in particular, which meant it belonged, effectively, to whoever showed up there first and spread their papers around. On the morning of the second day, I showed up first. I had the annex to myself for about an hour. I arranged my writing case, made a cup of tea on the service unit in the corner, and got through most of the session preamble on Form 11 before I became aware that I was not, in fact, alone. She was sitting on the floor near the far wall, in the narrow passage between the document shelving and the secondary heating unit, which was the warmest corner of the room. She had her knees drawn up and a small tin on the floor between her feet, and she was eating something from it with her fingers with the focused, unhurried concentration of someone who has been sitting in that spot for long enough to have grown comfortable. She had gray-blue skin, the particular shade of storm cloud before it commits to rain, and silver hair that someone had braided back and that had mostly come undone. Her ears came to a soft point. Her eyes, when she looked up at me, were amber, the warm, dark kind, like old honey and very large. She looked at me without alarm. I looked at her without, I hope, alarm. "Hello," I said. "Hello," she said. Her voice was clear and small and had the slightly formal quality of a child who has learned speech from adults rather than from other children. She looked back at her tin. I looked at my Form 11. I looked at her. "Are you supposed to be here?" I asked. She thought about this with what appeared to be genuine seriousness. "I don't know," she said. "Nobody told me where I was supposed to be." That seemed honest enough. I went back to my form. She went back to her tin. We sat in companionable silence for about 20 minutes, which is a longer stretch of silence than I usually manage with adults at treaty sessions. Eventually she said, without looking up, "What does arbitration mean?" I had my Form 11 in front of me. The header read Compact Trade Registry, Session Record, Velhari Boundary Compact Arbitration, which she must have been able to read from across the room, which meant her reading comprehension was fairly advanced for someone her size. It means that when two people disagree about something, I said, a third person who has no stake in the argument listens to both of them and helps them find what they can agree on. She turned this over. What if they can't agree on anything? Then I write that down too, I said, and someone else decides. Who decides? The compact panel, a committee. Does the committee always decide fairly? I considered lying. Not always, I said, but they try. She nodded, as if this confirmed something she had already suspected. She ate another bite from her tin. My name is Velsina, she said. Solon, I said. That's a short name. It suits me. She considered this with the same seriousness she had applied to the arbitration question. Then she went back to her tin, apparently satisfied, and I went back to my Form 11, and we didn't speak again for another half-hour until she said, "What does binding summary mean?" And I explained that too. It was a longer explanation than I expected to give. She asked 3 follow-up questions. By the time I was done, the morning session had started without me noticing, and I had produced only 4 lines on my Form 11. I caught up at the midday break. I didn't mind. Someone came for her around noon. A tall Velhari woman in an aide's uniform who appeared in the doorway with the controlled urgency of someone who has been looking for something for longer than they wanted to and has just found it. Velsina got up from the floor without being asked, tucked her tin under her arm, and walked toward the door. At the threshold, she turned back and looked at me. "Will you be here tomorrow?" she asked. "Probably," I said. She nodded once, as if filing this, and went with the aide. I looked at the warm corner where she had been sitting, and then at my Form 11, and then back at the corner. I went and got another cup of tea and finished the preamble, but I didn't stop thinking about the warm corner. She was there the next morning, same spot, different tin. She had brought a small folded cloth this time, which she spread over the cold stone floor before she sat down, which suggested she had thought about it between sessions. I had brought an extra cup. She looked at the cup when I set it on the shelf near her. "What is it?" "Tea. The service unit makes a decent Velharith blend, if you like it warm." She picked it up and held it in both hands the way children do, the whole cup cradled, not just the handle, and took a careful sip. She didn't say anything, but she kept holding it. We settled into the same arrangement as before. I had the morning session notes to prepare. She had her tin, and this time, a small folded object that turned out, when she opened it, to be a series of nested papers she had made into a kind of layered model. Not any shape I could identify, but clearly intentional, each fold precise. She worked on it steadily while I worked on my notes. After about an hour she said, without preamble, "Do you have children?" "No," I said. "Why not?" I set down my pen. "I was going to once. The person I was with decided they didn't want to stay." She absorbed this with the same level attention she gave everything. "That made you sad?" It wasn't a question. "For a while," I said. "Are you still sad?" "Not the way I was." She went back to her paper model. I went back to my notes. After another stretch she said, "I don't have a father." "I know," I said, and then, because I thought about it, "That's all right." She looked up at me then, really looked, the amber eyes direct and steady. "People usually say they're sorry," she said. "I know," I said, "but sorry is for things that are wrong. You're here, you seem fine to me." She looked at me for another moment. Then she went back to her paper model, and something in the set of her small shoulders eased slightly, the way a knot loosens when you stop pulling at it in the wrong direction. I found out later that was not a standard thing to say. The standard thing, apparently, was a formal expression of regret for the absent party, which is the Velhari convention for acknowledging an incomplete household structure. The convention is well-intentioned. The convention treats the absent party as the significant fact. What I had said, without knowing the convention existed, was that she was the significant fact. I didn't know that at the time. I just said what seemed true. The Velhari Boundary Compact sessions ran on a formal schedule. Morning plenary from 9th hour to midday, afternoon working groups from 14th to 17th, and whatever informal channel work both delegations could manage in the evenings. My job was to be present for all of it, document what was said, and produce Form 11 summaries for the compact panel by the end of each day. What this meant in practice was that I was in the annex for most of the day. Velsina was in the annex for most of the day. The aide came and went. Sometimes she appeared for an hour in the morning and didn't come back until the late afternoon. Once she didn't come at all. On that day, the third day, Velsina was in the annex when I arrived at 8th hour, and she was still there at the midday break, and she was still there when the afternoon plenary ended, and I came back to finish my Form 11. She had eaten both the tin she brought and the sandwich I had left for her at the midday break. She had finished the paper model and started another. She had, at some point during the afternoon, apparently become sleepy, and she was now sitting with her back against the heating unit and her head tipped sideways and her eyes at half-mast, fighting it. I went and got a blanket from the supply closet. The waystation kept them for long sessions and put it on the shelf beside her without saying anything. She looked at it, then at me, then took it and arranged it around herself with the same composed efficiency she applied to everything, and was asleep inside 3 minutes. I finished my Form 11. I worked quietly. She slept for about 2 hours and woke up without drama, folded the blanket and set it back on the shelf. "Thank you," she said. "You're welcome," I said. I did not know at the time that there was a long pane of frosted glass set high in the wall of the annex on the west side, the corridor side, through which, if the light was right, you could see the shape of someone standing still in the passage beyond. The Velhari delegation moved through the west corridor between the plenary room and their meeting spaces. The light that afternoon was clear and low, the kind of afternoon light that comes in flat from the orbital windows and angles through secondary glass at angles the architects probably didn't intend. I didn't know until later that someone had been standing there for the better part of an hour. On the 4th day, she brought me something. It was another of her paper models, a small folded thing about the size of my palm, made from the kind of stiff, formal paper the Velhari delegation used for their position documents. It had been folded into something that might have been a bird, or a ship, or something that had no name in either of our languages. She set it on the corner of my writing table, while I was looking at my notes, and didn't say anything about it. I picked it up, I turned it over. It had been made carefully, the folds were clean and exact, each one deliberate. Whatever it was, it had been thought about. "Is this for me?" I said. "Yes," she said. "Thank you." I set it at the top of my writing case where I could see it. She watched me do this with the patient, evaluating attention she turned on everything, and then apparently decided it was correctly done and went back to her own work. That afternoon she asked me to read to her. I hadn't brought anything to read. The only text I had with me was the Compact Registry Code reference, which is not, by any conventional measure, recreational reading. But she asked, and I had it, so I opened it to the section on arbitration procedure and read it to her in the same plain voice I use for everything. And she listened with the focused attention of someone who was taking notes, and she asked about every third word she didn't know, and I explained each one. And by the end of the afternoon, I had gotten through 12 pages of the code, and she had asked me 41 questions. At some point during this, I couldn't tell you exactly when, I became aware that what I was doing was not filling out a form or fulfilling an assignment or performing any function the Compact Trade Registry had sent me here to perform. I was sitting on the floor with my back against a heating unit, and a small alien child leaning against my shoulder, while I read her the arbitration procedural code, and I had shifted my position 20 minutes earlier so that the weight was better distributed and she wouldn't slide, and neither of us had commented on this adjustment. I was not doing it because someone had asked me to. I was doing it because it seemed like the right way to spend an afternoon, in the specific and unexamined way that some things simply seem right before you have thought about them long enough to complicate them. She fell asleep again around the 17th hour. I put the blanket over her. I finished my Form 11 at the writing table. The work was good that afternoon, neat, complete, all the session notes in proper order. I was in no particular hurry to leave. The frosted glass held no shadow. The corridor was empty. Or so I thought at the time. On the 5th day, the political situation shifted. I knew this because the session plenaries, which had been measured and procedural, acquired a new quality, a compression, a tension, like the air before weather. The Velhari delegation's lead counsel, a tall man named Vel Khan, presented 3 position amendments that the compact delegation had not seen in advance, which was not technically a violation of the session protocol but was, practically speaking, a maneuver. It is the kind of move that says, we are changing the frame of this conversation, and you did not see us do it until now. Every arbitration clerk recognizes it, because it is the same move regardless of the parties and the subject and the language. The frame shifts, and someone is standing in a different room than they thought. The compact's senior representative, a woman named Aviath Korin, whom I had worked with twice before, received the amendments with the flat expression she kept for things that annoyed her. The Velhari sovereign, who I had been watching across the plenary table for 5 days from my seat at the clerk's station, who I had been observing with the same careful attention I applied to all session principles, noting position, language, comportment, received them with nothing. No expression, no shift in posture, no adjustment of her hands. She received them the way a stone receives water without changing. I noted this in my Form 11. It is exactly the kind of detail a good clerk records. What I understand now, that I did not fully understand then, is what it costs to receive something that way. I know what it costs because I have, in the years since, watched her do it many times, and I have learned to see the fine line between composed and contained and the narrower line between contained and at the edge of what can be held. She was, on the 5th day, near the narrower line. The amendments were not a surprise to her. The timing was not a surprise to her. What they were was a declaration. We know what you have and we intend to use it. The afternoon working groups ran long. I was in the plenary room until nearly the 19th hour with my pen moving, and my hand cramping and my Form 11 growing to 3 times its normal length. By the time I got back to the annex it was empty. Velsina was gone. The blanket was folded on the shelf. The cup from the morning was clean and set beside the service unit. I sat at my table and looked at the paper model she had given me, which was still at the top of my writing case, and I thought about the position amendments and what they meant for the session, and I thought about whether the compact panel would send someone senior to handle the response, and I thought, with a clarity that was slightly surprising to me, that I hoped the sessions didn't end early, because early sessions mean early departures. And I didn't want Velsina to leave before I'd finished reading her the arbitration code. I had gotten through 12 pages. There were 432 remaining. I didn't examine what this meant with any great thoroughness. I was a clerk. I documented what was in front of me and left interpretation to the panel. But I stayed in the annex for another hour before I went to my room, longer than I needed to, just in case. On the 6th day, the aide didn't come at all. Velsina was in the annex at 7th hour, which was earlier than I usually arrived, and she was there when I came in, and she looked up at me when I entered the way she always did, the steady amber gaze, appraising and calm, and then looked back at her paper model. I made 2 cups of tea. I had brought a different book that morning, a collection of what the Compact's library called classical literature, which turned out to be a reasonably diverse anthology of short pieces from about a dozen member species. I had picked it up at the station library on a whim, which was not a thing I typically did. I told myself it was because the code was getting repetitive. This was not entirely dishonest. We read for 3 hours. She asked questions about the stories, not just the words, questions about why the characters made the choices they made, whether those choices were right, what should have happened instead. I answered the ones I could and told her honestly when I didn't know. She accepted both kinds of answer with the same equanimity. She did not seem to think that not knowing was a problem. She seemed to think it was just another piece of information. At the midday break, she shared her lunch with me. The tin contained something that smelled of warm spices and turned out to be excellent. A grain-based dish with something sharp underneath that I couldn't identify and didn't need to. And I shared the sandwich I had bought from the station canteen, and we ate in the quiet companionship that had become, over 6 days, simply the texture of the morning. I thought about the fifth-day amendments while I ate. I thought about Velcon's face across the table and the sovereign stillness and what was underneath it. I had been a clerk long enough to know when a move was preparatory, when the thing presented was not the thing intended. The amendments were procedural. What was coming next would not be. In the afternoon, Velsina fell asleep with her head on my arm, and I kept reading to myself, and didn't move for 2 hours because she was small and she was sleeping, and it seemed like the most reasonable thing to do. The light from the orbital windows tracked across the floor and climbed the far wall, and the annex was quiet, and outside in the plenary room and the working group corridors whatever was coming next was assembling itself. The frosted glass, when I thought to look, held a shadow. Still, for a long time, I did not, in the moment, connect the shadow to anything beyond the normal traffic of the West Corridor. I looked at it for a moment and looked back at my book, and later, much later, I understood what I had seen. On the evening of the 7th day, someone knocked on the door of my assigned room. I was reviewing my Form 11 summaries from the week. It was the 21st hour, which is late by treaty session standards, late enough that the session building was largely quiet. I went to the door and opened it. The woman in the corridor was tall, with the same gray-blue coloring as Velsina, though deeper, a darker shade, the blue of deep water rather than storm cloud. Her hair was silver-white, coiled back in the formal Velhari style I had seen on the delegation members. She wore a plain dark coat with no insignia, which was slightly unusual for the hour, but not impossible. The coat was the kind a person wears when they want to be plain rather than formal, when they want the conversation to be between the people rather than the offices. She was not wearing any of the formal markers I had learned to recognize from 7 days of plenary sessions, but I knew who she was. I had not put it together from looking at Velsina, which is perhaps worth explaining. I had been watching the Velhari sovereign across the plenary table for a week, and I had been spending mornings with Velsina in the annex, and at no point had my mind placed the two images in the same frame. They share coloring and eye shape, and a particular quality of stillness that is different from other kinds of stillness. The stillness of a person who is paying close attention, rather than the stillness of a person who is empty or frightened. But Velsina was a child sitting on a floor eating from a tin, and the person I had been watching across the plenary table was a sovereign receiving position amendments from a hostile faction, and those two images do not naturally assemble themselves in a low-grade clerk's working mind. I had not been looking for a connection. I had simply not been looking. I looked now. "Clerk Vaith," she said. "Your sovereignty," I said. I stepped back from the door. She came in. I found the 2 chairs in the room and indicated one. She took it. I sat in the other. My Form 11 drafts were still spread on the small table between us. I put them aside. She sat with the composure of someone who has been composed in difficult rooms for a long time, but there was something underneath it, something that was not quite strain, but that I recognized in the way you recognize a thing you felt yourself. The careful, contained quality of a person who is about to say something they have no protocol for. She had been prepared for the amended positions. She had not been prepared to sit down in a small borrowed room and have this particular conversation. The coat said as much. "She talks about you," she said. "She's a remarkable child," I said. "I know," a pause. "She doesn't talk to many people. In the way she talks to you." I didn't know what to say to that. I said, "She asks very precise questions." Something crossed the sovereign's face, not a smile exactly, the suggestion of one like the memory of one. "Yes, she has always done that." We sat for a moment in the particular silence of two people who are in the same room for a reason that neither of them has named yet. "I want to explain something to you," she said, "about why she has been in the annex." "You don't have to," I said. "I think I should." She considered how to begin. "The treaty sessions there are factions within my delegation that I do not fully control, Vel Khan and the people behind him. They have been looking for grounds to challenge my standing to negotiate. Specifically, any personal encumbrance that they can characterize as a conflict of interest or an undisclosed complication." I understood then why there was no aide reliably present, why Velsina was in the annex with her lunch tin, why no one from the Velhari delegation had come to collect her, had come to explain her presence, had come to position her formally or introduce her or contextualize her in any way that would put her name in the session record. She was in the annex because putting her anywhere visible, anywhere on the documented record of the week's proceedings, put her in a line of fire. "Your daughter," I said. "Yes, her existence is not a secret. I have not hidden her. But her presence here was unplanned. Her creche keeper had a family emergency, and there was no suitable alternative arrangement on short notice, and I could not leave her at home for 12 days with the sessions running and no certainty of—" She stopped, collected herself. "I should have found a better arrangement. I was managing a great deal, and I made a practical decision under pressure that has turned out to be more complicated than I intended." "She hasn't been any trouble," I said. "I know, I've been watching." She looked at me steadily. "I've been watching for several days." There was something in this that I was not entirely sure how to receive. Not surveillance, exactly, or not only that. I thought of the shadow in the frosted glass. The shadow that had been there for an hour still, while Velsina slept against my arm. "She was cold," I said. "The first afternoon I got her a blanket." "Yes," she said. "She asked me to read to her. I didn't have anything better than the code." "She quoted a procedural definition to me this morning," the sovereign said, "regarding the conditions under which arbitration outcomes may be appealed." "Section 14, paragraph 3, I said. "She asked about it twice. It's a counterintuitive provision. The language says may be appealed in circumstances where the practical situation will almost certainly be appealed." I told her the code is occasionally optimistic. The sovereign looked at me for a moment longer than the observation warranted. Then she said, "The faction filed an inquiry this afternoon, while you were in the plenary room, about Velsina's presence here and about my failure to disclose her in the session preamble. Velkhan intends to argue that my undisclosed personal circumstances compromise my authority to speak for the Velhari sovereign authority in treaty negotiations. He will present this to the compact panel tomorrow morning." I absorbed this. Can he do that? He can attempt it. The compact panel would have to rule on whether the inquiry has merit. If they find that it does, if they find that I withheld material personal information from the session preamble, they can suspend my standing and require the Velhari authority to appoint a replacement negotiator. The treaty would be delayed by at minimum 60 days. She held my gaze. "Part of the inquiry involves the question of whether I have sought or accepted informal support through a back channel. My daughter spending 7 days in the company of a compact clerk would appear, to people who wanted to appear that way, as exactly that." I understood now why she was here. I understood the coat. I understood the 21st hour. I said, "What do you need from me?" She looked at the table, at my Form 11 drafts, at the small paper model that I had set on the corner of my writing case and brought back to my room at the end of each day, which was still there, which she would now be seeing for the first time. I watched her see it. Something in her face shifted briefly and then settled. She was quiet for a long moment, longer than the strategic answer required. Then she said something I had not expected. "The inquiry also raises the question of my personal status," she said. "Velkon's position argument requires him to characterize my daughter as an encumbrance that I have not disclosed in my capacity as sovereign. Under Velhari Convention, that characterization has significantly reduced standing if my personal status is clarified, formalized." A pause. "There is a provision in our custom, a declaration of partnership. If made formally during a treaty session, before a compact witness of record, it supersedes an encumbrance inquiry under the session protocol." I was a clerk. I understood documents. I understood the mechanism she was describing. "You need a witness," I said. "Yes," she said. And then, with a precision and a plainness that I understood later must have cost her something, must have been the hardest sentence she had spoken in years, harder than anything she had said across the plenary table, she said, "The witness must be the named partner." I sat with this for a moment. There was no version of this moment that was small or routine. "I want to be honest with you," she said. "This is a legal mechanism. I recognize that this is not a conventional request. I recognize that I am asking you to consider something formal and significant for reasons that are, on my side, partly strategic. I do not want to obscure that. You should know what this is and what it isn't." "All right," I said. "I know what it is. There are implications. A named partnership with the Ari sovereign carries obligations on both sides. Some of them are ceremonial. Some of them are not." She held my gaze. "I am not in a position to offer you a full accounting of every implication in this conversation. I can tell you that none of them are trivial." "I understand," I said. "And my daughter," she stopped. This was the harder part. This was the part beneath the strategy. She arrived at it the same way she arrived at everything, straight on, without looking away. "If you enter a named partnership with the Velhari sovereign, you enter it knowing that there is a daughter. Velsina is 3 years old. She is my daughter in every way that a daughter can be someone's, and that does not change under any formal mechanism or any future circumstance. If you said yes to the mechanism and intended to set her aside, or treat her as peripheral, or simply as the complicated detail of the arrangement." "I wouldn't," I said. She looked at me. "I've spent 7 days with her," I said. "I know who she is. She's not peripheral." She was very still. "You understand what I am asking?" "Yes," I said. "I am asking if you will enter a formal partnership with me, knowing that I have a daughter, knowing that the mechanism is in part strategic, knowing that this is not." She searched for the word, and I saw how hard it was for her to find it, the word for a thing that sat between the legal and the personal, and had no existing category in either of their systems. "Knowing that this is not the ordinary way that such things begin." I looked at the paper model on my writing case. The small folded thing Velsina had made me on the 4th morning and given me without ceremony, and watched me put at the top of my case where I could see it, and which I had packed carefully at the end of each day, and set out again at the beginning of the next without thinking about why. The folds were exact, and the shape had no name, and it was the most deliberate gift I had received in years. "Yes," I said. She looked at me. "I'm answering you," I said. "Yes, to the partnership, to Velsina, to whatever the obligations are, yes." She was very quiet. She had the look of someone who has prepared themselves for several outcomes, and the one that arrived was not among them, not because it was worse, but because it was simpler, because it came without conditions attached, and without the pause she had expected while I weighed things. "You didn't think about it," she said. "I did," I said. "I've been thinking about it since the first day she asked me what arbitration meant. I just didn't know what I was thinking about until now." She sat with that. She was composed. She was always composed. But there was something in her composure now that was different from what it had been when she came in. Something that had shifted a fraction of an inch in some internal direction, the way a long-held breath finally goes. "You should know," she said, "that the named partnership can be dissolved after the treaty session closes if either party—" "I'm not thinking about that," I said. "I'm telling you that the option exists. I want you to have full information." "I know it exists," I said. "I'm a clerk. I know about exit provisions. I know they're in every formal document because the code requires them. I'm not thinking about that one." She looked at me for a long time. The amber eyes, Velsina's eyes, with the same quality of direct attention the child brought to everything she looked at. "Why?" she said. I thought about it. I wanted to give her an honest answer, which meant finding the honest one rather than the convenient one. "Because Velsina asked me if I'd be there tomorrow," I said, and I said probably, and probably isn't good enough. It was a plain thing to say. It was the only true thing I had. The sovereign who was going to be, as of the filing of a declaration before an arbitration witness the following morning, something more than the sovereign to me, put her hands flat on the table and looked at them, and I had the distinct sense that she was doing something difficult and internal that she had not allowed herself in a long time, and what it looked like from the outside was very simple. It looked like relief, not the relief of something averted, the relief of something finally set down. "All right," she said. "All right," I said. We sat for a while longer in the room with my Form 11 drafts and the paper model and the 2 chairs, and I made tea on the small service unit by the window because it was the 21st hour and neither of us had eaten recently and tea was what I had. And she took the cup and held it the same way Velsina held cups, with both hands, and I didn't say anything about that. Then she said she had to return to the West Wing before the Ley Tower monitors logged her absence, and I walked her to the door, and she stopped at the threshold and looked back at me. "She won't understand the formal mechanism," she said, "not for some years." "I know," I said, "that's fine. When she does understand, I don't know what she'll—" "She asks precise questions," I said. "She'll ask more. I'll answer them. That's what I'm good at." The sovereign looked at me for one more moment with those eyes, and then she inclined her head, not the formal Ari gesture I'd seen across the plenary table, but something smaller and more personal, and went down the corridor. I went back to my table. I looked at the Form 11 drafts. I looked at the paper model. Then I got out a fresh sheet of paper and started a new document. Not a compact form, just a document. The date at the top, my name, the declaration in my own words. The kind of thing a clerk writes when he wants something on record that the existing forms don't have a category for. I wrote it plainly. I wrote what I had been asked. I wrote what I had answered. I wrote that I had answered without hesitation, which was the truth, and why it was the truth, which I had not had occasion to write down before but which seemed, that night, worth making permanent. The declaration was filed the following morning before the 9th hour plenary. I signed it as witness and named partner both, which is a procedural irregularity the compact code doesn't strictly address but doesn't prohibit either, and the session administrator accepted it because the session administrator was a practical woman named Eller Seath who read the mechanism provision, read Velcon's inquiry, read the declaration, cross-referenced the relevant session protocol, and said, in the flat voice of someone who has made a decision and is done making it, that the inquiry was superseded and the session would proceed. Velcon's faction challenged it. The compact panel was convened to hear the challenge at the 12th hour. I sat in the back of the hearing room and produced, when asked, a series of Form 11 summaries that documented the exact number of times Velsina had been present in the annex, the exact nature of our interactions as I had recorded them in the daily summaries, the declaration itself with its timestamp, and the session administrator's countersignature, and the specific passage of the Compact Registry Code pertaining to voluntary disclosure by a treaty party of personal status during an active session, in which paragraph 7 makes clear that voluntary disclosure made before a witness of record supersedes any prior omission for the purposes of the session preamble. I am good at finding the specific passage. I have had 22 years of practice. The panel deliberated for 4 hours. They ruled in the sovereign's favor. Velcon's faction filed a notation of dissent, which is their right under the protocol, and the notation was entered into the session record, which is also their right, and then the session continued. The treaty was signed on the 12th day. It is, by most accounts, a good treaty. The boundary provisions held for 11 years before the first renegotiation, which is longer than the average. I was not in the room for the signing, clerks rarely are, but Eller-Seith described it to me afterward as quiet and efficient, which I took as a compliment to everyone involved. I filled out the final Form 11. It was the longest one I had ever written. It was also, by some margin, the most important work I had ever done, which is a thing I find genuinely funny when I think about it. 22 years of sessions and treaties and binding summaries, and the Form 11 that mattered most was the one with the most procedural footnotes and the attachment of a handwritten declaration about a paper model and a cup of tea. On the morning of the last day, Velsina came to the annex one more time. She was wearing traveling clothes, a small coat, formal Velhari style, with the collar buttoned, and she had her tin and her paper model materials in a bag over her shoulder. She stood in the doorway and looked at me across the room the way she always did. "The sessions are done," she said. "Yes," I said. "We're going home." "I know." She came across the room and stood at the corner of my table and looked at the paper model she had given me, which was still at the top of my writing case. I had packed almost everything else. The model was the last thing I'd left out. "You kept it," she said. "Yes," I said. She was quiet for a moment, the serious amber eyes. "My mother said you signed a paper." "I did," I said. She thought about this with her characteristic seriousness, the same attention she brought to arbitration procedure and the questions in the stories. "What does the paper mean?" "It means I'll be around," I said, "for a long time if that's all right with you." She looked at me, directly, in the way she had looked at me the first time she asked me if I would be there tomorrow. Not a child's look, exactly. The look of a small person with the full capacity of their attention brought to bear on one question. "You'll answer questions," she said. "Every one," I said. "Even the long ones." "Especially those." She considered this, ran the appropriate evaluation. Then, with the composed decision of someone who has applied the right analysis and reached a conclusion she trusts, she stepped forward and put her arms around me and pressed her face briefly against my coat. It lasted about 4 seconds. She let go, stepped back, straightened her small coat and picked up her bag. She looked at me once more. "All right," she said. "All right," I said. She walked to the door. She stopped at the threshold. Her mother had stopped there too, the night before, and looked back. "I'll have more questions," she said. "I know," I said. "I'll be ready." She nodded once, satisfied, and went down the corridor. I looked at the paper model on my writing case. Then I wrapped it carefully in a piece of the stiff formal paper the Velhari delegation used for position documents, fitting, I thought, and I thought it without irony, and put it at the very top of my bag, where it would travel safely. I have it still, 17 years later. It sits on the shelf above my desk, in the house on the Velhari secondary reach where I have lived for 12 of those 17 years. It has held up better than you might expect from a folded thing. She made it well. She made everything well, even then. She was 20 years old in the spring. She has her mother's composure and her mother's eyes, and she asks questions with a precision that has not diminished in the slightest since the morning she asked me what arbitration meant from her corner by the heating unit. The questions are harder now. She moved on from the code years ago and has developed a genuine interest in the theoretical underpinnings of treaty law, which I understand well enough to be useful and not well enough to be infallible, which suits her because she does not want an oracle, she wants an interlocutor. I have been that. I will keep being that. She is going to be a formidable person. She already is. People ask me sometimes, people who know the story, or think they know it, whether I understood what I was saying yes to, whether I grasped the scope of it, the implications, the obligations that came with a named partnership filed in a treaty session document at the 21st hour on the 7th day. Whether a low-grade compact arbitration clerk could have known, in the 22nd year of his career, sitting in a room with Form 11 drafts spread on the table and a paper model at the top of his writing case, what he was committing to. I tell them the truth, which is this: I didn't know all of it. I couldn't have. No one knows all of what they're saying yes to, because the whole of a thing doesn't exist yet when you say yes to it. It assembles itself over time, out of ordinary days and long questions and cups of tea, and a child who fell asleep against your arm while you read her the arbitration code. You can't know all of it in advance. You're not supposed to. But I knew the paper model. I knew the 41 questions about the code. I knew the amber eyes that had asked me whether I would be there tomorrow, and I knew that probably was not good enough. I knew that the woman sitting across from me in a plain dark coat had done something very hard and very uncalculated in coming to that room, and that she was holding herself still while she waited for an answer that could have gone the other way, and that the answer was the only thing I had that was worth giving. I gave it without hesitation. I gave it without hesitation because there was, genuinely, nothing to hesitate about. Not from my side. Not for a man who knew what the paper model meant, and what the folded cloth on the cold floor meant, and what 4 seconds of a child's arms around your coat means when you have been a long time without that particular weight in your life. The mechanism was strategic, the answer was not. That is all I have ever been able to tell people when they ask. It is, as it happens, enough.